This is Shabana Mahmood, the newly appointed Home Secretary, who says she wants to get tougher on illegal migration. What's she going to do? And in fact, has she started doing it already? We will pose and answer those questions on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Chris, the new cabinet in action today, and already quite a lot of focus on the new Home Secretary.
Yeah, Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, and with a new ministerial team in the Home Office too. There was something of a clear-out, really, of ministers alongside the moving of Yvette Cooper. And there's a subtlety here because, you know, Yvette Cooper got that dealing with illegal immigration was absolutely key and central to the government's political prospects. But the view taken in government is that Shabana Mahmood is unflinching in her instincts, and they think that perhaps she might be able to make quicker progress on the whole issue of small boats and visa overstayers, the whole question of irregular migration. That's their hope, and of course in time we'll work out if there is anything in that. And here we were on the new Home Secretary's effectively first proper full day in the job, certainly as far as a weekday is concerned, and she was centre stage at a get-together of Home Ministers, Interior Ministers, call them what you like, from the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which has been around for almost the best part of a century, which is the UK and the US and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Now, again, this wasn't a meeting Shabana Mahmood had rustled up in the space of 48 hours. Yvette Cooper would have been there if there hadn't been a reshuffle. But she was very much using it to sort of lean into a sense of the kind of platter of tools that the government is trying to assemble and then talk about to deal with this whole question of illegal immigration. Not just small boats, obviously that's a big part of it and a very visible part of it, but also visa overstayers, so people who arrive legally on a visa but then don't leave when the visa expires. And how do you collectively pull together a range of measures that might do something about that overall challenge?
And one of the tools in the toolkit is this idea of issuing fewer visas to countries if those countries do not cooperate with the UK about returning people from the UK to those countries.
Yeah.
And here is Shabana Mahmood talking about that particular tool.
For us, that means including possibly the cutting of visas in the future, just to say, you know, we do expect countries to play ball, play by the rules, and if one of your citizens has no right to be in our country, you do need to take them back.
Chris, help me out here. I assumed that was a power that the government's already had for a little while.
And that is the argument that the Conservatives make. I think what is interesting about this is the extent to which the government leans into using it. So I was talking to somebody from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford this afternoon, and I said to them, well, hang on a minute. Are there not a lot of people who will come from particular countries who are deemed to be illegal immigrants, but for whom the UK doesn't actually issue many visas? In other words, to what extent can this make some difference? And there is an element of that, as particularly those around, not exclusively, but particularly around those who might arrive by small boat. But on the issue of the question of visa overstayers, there are some countries to whom the UK gives lots of their nationals visas, not least India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal, India in particular, where because of the number of visas that are given, there are quite a lot who overstay their visa, even if the proportion is relatively small. And so you could decide to be quite restrictive around that. But the challenge with that is that up to now, at least, governments of various colours have taken the decision that it is rational to offer plenty of visas, say, to people from India. And of course, the UK and India have a close relationship. There was that trade deal that was done relatively recently. India values the visa access that it gets to the UK. So there are a whole range of approaches that could be taken, from increasing the costs of visas, in other words, limiting the potential demand, to, you know, an outright squeeze in the numbers. But then you're going to be doing that alongside managing the diplomatic relationship with the country that you're dealing with. And I think, as I say, it's one of these sort of, what they hope is this toolkit of measures. They're very conscious of the visibility of small boats, basically the pictures from the White Cliffs of most days or lots of days. But there's the other element that is less visible, but also a big contributor to numbers, which is visa overstayers.
And help me out with something else here, Chris, which just wasn't clear as I was watching the news and listening to news podcasts from rural France last week.
Mm-hmm.
What is the government's position on ID cards?
Yeah.
Are they going to happen? Are they sort of noodling the idea around? What is it?
They are noodling. I like a noodle. Noodle's a good word, isn't it? They are noodling around with it. So interestingly, I went to do an interview with the Prime Minister in Glasgow last week and was invited to do it before the whole Angela Rayner thing was as news.
Because it was meant to be about this subject,
it was meant to be about this, yeah. And what he had to say about ID cards, which didn't get a vast amount of attention last week, we did report it online and on Radio 4 and elsewhere, but it didn't get as much attention as it otherwise would because of the Angela Rayner row. What he had to say about ID cards was really interesting because he really lent into the idea of him thinking that they could be a very useful tool in dealing with the pull factors of the UK, and in particular, if you like, the black economy. And I was told he would be up for saying something about it, but I thought he might be quite guarded and not say very much at all. And he actually really lent into it and made an argument that says, because you might recall in the midst of time, the previous Labour government, Tony Blair, had a crack at doing all of this and has long been an advocate of them, but it never happened and there was a massive row and then the coalition government squashed the idea. The government has, in the last couple of weeks, people have been sort of falling over themselves to say that they're giving them a look. So Pat McFadden, the now Work and Pension Secretary, when he was in his previous job, went out to the Baltic states to look at the idea. The Prime Minister's talked about them. Shabana Mahmood today was saying she's always been a fan of them. She was a fan of them the first time round and she's still a fan of them now. The crucial thing, though, Adam, I was talking to the Conservatives about this, and you know, politically, I think the government's drawn to it because some of its opponents aren't so keen, or in some places are divided. So, Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, last week was sounding quite sceptical about the idea. Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, is much warmer about one potential iteration of an ID card. And this is the crucial thing the government's not spelling out now. Would it be a card that proved your right to work? There's mechanisms around that already. Would it be a card, and when I say card, a digital equivalent of a card that proved your right to access public services, like the NHS? Or would it be something that we'd all have to carry? And clearly the difference between those things is huge in terms of the arguments that could come along as far as civil liberties are concerned and all the rest of it. And also, therefore, where the dividing lines are between different political parties and people within a political party who might have a different view from their colleagues. So we don't yet know precisely what they want to do. They say they are exploring it. But it seems to me, given what the Prime Minister said to me the other day and what we've heard from the Home Secretary today, who would have not freelanced with their own personal view if it didn't tessellate with that of the government that she's just taken a very senior job in, they're coming. This is an idea the government is going to run with, and I think will be willing to pick a political fight over, knowing that some of their opponents will have a very different view.
Although we need to be realistic here, like the time frame for introducing something as vast as that in a country as big as this is like, we're talking decades potentially.
It's long, and there's all sorts of secondary questions as well, aren't there? Even for those who might be in principle in favour, which is how do you build, the database, the IT, the security of information. Governments don't have a wonderful track record for necessarily, and indeed sometimes with the private enterprise as well. Looking after personal data, etc., etc. So there's massive kind of question marks around how you go about doing it, the timescale, the sort of magnitude of the idea. But it does seem like politically they are pretty keen on it as another example, as they would see it, of a tool in the toolbox that they're willing to use.
And we got details today of the timescale for the election of a new deputy leader of the Labour Party.
Yeah, so little quirk here. So you might think, well, hang on a minute, the reshuffle happened on Friday. Angela Rayner resigned from 3 jobs. So she resigned as Deputy Prime Minister, she resigned as Housing Secretary, she also resigned as the directly elected Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, elected by the Labour Party itself. And so there is a vacancy. And today what we found out, the party's National Executive Committee has met and it's agreed the kind of rules and timetable. And it's quick. It's quick. We'll find out who the new Deputy Leader is at the end of next month. I think it's Saturday the 25th of October. And by the end of this week, we'll know who the candidates are, or at least have a reasonable sense of them, because they'll have to have met the threshold of finding 80 of their colleagues, MPs, to have backed them. And then there's also thresholds around local support and all the rest of it. So the bar's pretty high. Some are already grumbling that it's being rushed. the flip side to that is that I speak to folk in and around government, and indeed Labour backbenchers who want the government to succeed, who just think the whole thing is the potential for a total nightmare, because the very nature of a conversation about wanting to be deputy leader is that it's ultimately going to be a political argument about whether Labour is any good in government, being conducted by people on their own side.
Although, is there a possibility that this contest never even really gets going? Because if if you need to get 80 members of the parliamentary party voting for you, and that happens next week, if only one person gets through that, then that's it done, isn't it?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, possibly.
Although now that I say that out loud, that sounds quite unlikely.
Yeah, I mean,
because the Labour Parliamentary Party is so huge,
exactly.
You would have to just have a total landslide victory within your fellow MPs.
Even if you got a runaway candidate amongst the MPs who maybe got, and I'm making these numbers up, obviously, 160. In other words, way more than they need. Given the scale of the parliamentary party, there are still hundreds of votes to grapple for. So it seems likely that there'll be a handful of candidates, but no more than that. 3 or 4. I mean, the maths doesn't work to have many more than that. And it's all going to happen super quick. So there'll be hustings this week. We'll soon have a sense of who the cliche alert runners and riders are. And then it's a case of, who does the government want? Is there anyone who is in government who wants to stand? Because they might fear that would be a pretty brutal experience, because they'd have to toe the line of government policy. And inevitably, the conversation is going to be about whether the government policy on X, Y, and Z is any good. And then from the government's perspective, can they find someone who is sort of broadly loyal to the government project, but can be a critical, constructive friend, rather than someone who perhaps is, as they might see it, a bit less constructive, or, to put it another way, a bit more kind of outspoken, a bit gobbier, really. And then there's as ever with these things, there's a sort of balance of outlook and geography and all the rest of it. Speaking to one person in government, I think that their dream candidate would be somebody who was from the north of England, was a woman, and was willing to be constructively critical. And then, interestingly, I was talking to Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, on behalf of all the broadcasters in one of these pool clips, and I said, would you imagine this person would be in government in the way that Angela Rayner was? And his answer effectively, I haven't got the exact words in front of me, but was effectively, they wouldn't have to be. So, there is a Deputy Prime Minister, of course, David Lammy now. Doesn't have to be the same person as the Deputy Leader. But yeah, it's one of those sort of quirks of Labour Party democracy, which plenty of people within the party are very proud of, but when in government comes with a inevitable awkwardness, potentially, particularly if it gets very, very noisy.
Well, I've been noodling around. Do you actually say noodling around, or is it just plain old noodling? Anyway, I have been discussing all of these issues and more with one of the newly appointed members of the cabinet. It is the Secretary of State for Scotland, Douglas Alexander, who actually is not a newcomer to that job, because he did it way back in the noughties. So this is his second go at being Scotland Secretary, and his first go at being on Newscast, I think, maybe ever. And Douglas Alexander is here. Hello.
Hello, good to see you.
Well, good to hear you. I'm just remembering back through the history books. You were in the Scotland office as the Secretary of State for Scotland 18 years ago, weren't you?
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah.
When you were a whippersnapper then, though, weren't you?
Yes, I did it when I was 2. No, it was a few years ago. I served for a year under Tony Blair in the final year of his leadership, 2006-2007.
Does that feel like ancient political history, or actually does it still feel quite recent? Because imagine if you're sitting back behind the same desk.
No, it feels like an eternity ago, is the honest answer. Partly because so much changes in that period. I was talking to the team in the Scotland office when I arrived this morning, and they were asking how different it was. And I said, well, let me give you a couple of numbers. I said, when I was elected in November 1997 to the House of Commons, the British economy was bigger than the Chinese economy. And in 2007, 10 years later, when I became Secretary of State for Scotland, the Eurozone economy was the same size as the American economy. And the American economy today is twice the size of the Eurozone. So we're in a very different world. It's a very different time, very different political challenges.
That's kind of giving me a bit of vertigo thinking about all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of getting the appointment, I mean, is it true that most of this reshuffle happened on the phone?
Yeah, so basically I started the week in Tokyo Bay on HMS Prince of Wales, the flagship of the Royal Navy, with John Healey, the Defence Secretary, beating the drum and making the case for British business in Japan. I then went to Korea for trade talks because we're trying to close a trade deal with the Koreans. I flew back to the UK. Number 10 were in touch asking if I would do the media round, as it's called, the series of interviews first thing on Friday morning about
And you said, no, I'm busy.
no, because I didn't know what was coming. I said, yes, of course. So it was on notionally on defence expenditure and an investment, which managed about a question at the end of each of the interviews, as it turned out. But I said, yes, that was fine. I'm due to be at home in East Lothian, but I kept myself down in London on Friday morning to do the media. Obviously, events unfolded from Wednesday onwards in terms of Angela Rayner receiving additional legal advice and ultimately her resignation following on Friday. So, if you like, the day just kind of developed. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do media interviews, and by the end of the day, I was the Secretary of State for Scotland. So it was not a day that any of us was expecting, to be honest.
Yeah. And I mean, you're a veteran of this, but what do you think of this system that you can have an international trade job one day and then a completely different one that afternoon? I mean, is that actually a good system that we've got?
So I think there's a couple of points I'd make. Firstly, in any human organisation, things are going to happen. And in that sense, I don't think anybody could credibly look you in the eye and say, this time last week, there was any expectation that there would be a reshuffle, anything like as wide or as deep as the one that ended up happening on Friday. So there's just a degree of circumstance in this. On the second point, I think the Prime Minister always has the responsibility and indeed the right to choose the team that he wants depending on circumstance. And you say it's not my first rodeo. It was about almost exactly 14 months in that Tony Blair undertook his first reshuffle after being elected in May 1997. So it's not altogether surprising that there was a change. I think from what I understand, it's as much what I've read in the media as anywhere else. The expectation was there would be a reshuffle later in the autumn, but that obviously all got pulled forward as a result of Angela's resignation.
I wasn't making a point about so much the political choice of the timing or the timing being thrust on the Prime Minister. It's more just the kind of the intellectual thing, and whether it's a good idea that you have people who have got their head buried in one brief and then they're expected to get up to speed on a completely different brief. I mean, I suppose Scotland is your home, so it's like not like you were moving into something completely random.
I'm revealing myself as a bit of an outlier in this, Adam, but not only have I been the Secretary of State for Scotland in a previous life, I had also been the Trade Minister in a previous life. I was the Trade Minister 2004, 2005, so it was almost 20 years on from that I was appointed to be Trade Policy and Economic Security Minister by the Prime Minister back in July. So that's unusual. Of course it is. I suppose I would say if you look at the broader sweep of history, some of the people who have done jobs really well have started out without a significant level of deep domain knowledge in their subject matter. And to set aside partisan politics, I think if you look at the record, for example, of Ken Clarke as Chancellor after Black Wednesday, between 1992 and 1997, most economists think Ken Clarke turned out to be a pretty good Chancellor, despite having been the Home Secretary, as I recollect, the Health Secretary, maybe the Employment Secretary. He did a pretty wide-ranging career. So, of course, every job tests the minister, and in that sense, you've got a right to expect that you'll have ministers on top of the brief doing the work. But there are examples of where people have shifted and turned out to be pretty effective at their jobs.
Very generous of you to anoint a Conservative with that.
Well, it's so deep in the ancient history that I thought it was
safe.
probably safe to do so. And in rather stark contrast to Liz Truss and more recent predecessors.
Oh, there we go. Back, but the normal service is resumed.
Exactly. Worry not.
I mean, what was the message, do you think, that Keir Starmer was trying to send with this reshuffle? Was it just, actually, someone's gone, it's an opportunity to have a refresh? Or is there some kind of like deeper truth to it?
Well, I've seen some of the coverage this morning in the papers, and I think there is a degree of truth in recognising the absolute primacy of economic growth for this government. And in terms of, no doubt, the work that Peter Kyle will be doing, coming in as Business and Trade Secretary in the department I used to work in. He's off both to the United States and then to China this week, as I understand it, whether it is Pat McFadden in what I think will be a pretty significant new ministry that combines what we conventionally think of as social security or welfare policy, but with skills policy as well. So really, if you like, labour market reform. If you think of Steve Reid coming into what was MHCLG, these terrible acronyms that people use in government, but a politician with a huge amount of experience, both in terms of development and housing policy in particular, I think there will be a pretty strong focus on growth in those ministries supporting Rachel and the work that the Treasury is doing.
Yeah, but were the previous incumbents in those jobs not focused enough on growth? Did they not want it enough?
No, but Adam, I really like the newscast in the way that we can have a conversation. That feels a kind of gotcha question. If you make the point, is there a zero-sum game and everyone else was rubbish? No, of course that's not the point. It is the case that if you think of a football team, the manager always has the right to choose the team. Sometimes there are more players than you're able to field. With some football clubs, there's not enough players that you'd like to field. In this case, I think genuinely, as the manager of the team, the Prime Minister was right to say, who do I want playing in what position in order that we can make sure that we're delivering on our goals.
A gotcha question. I don't even know what that means.
Forgive the very idea.
Okay, and in terms of the Scotland brief, I mean, what are your ideas for economic growth? How can you in Scotland contribute to that?
Well, if you look at just the last week, we've had a £340 million investment into the Rosyth dockyard. And if you look also just in the same week, we had a £10 billion order, the largest ever warship export order, placed on the Clyde, both the Scotsman Yard and the Govan Yard by BAE Systems. That was from the Norwegian government. So just in the last week, we've had two extraordinary and significant announcements that will guarantee about 15 years of shipbuilding in the city that you come from and I come from in Glasgow, that guarantees a really bright future for the Rosyth dockyard. What I was involved with today, along with Luke Pollard, the new Defence Procurement Minister, was briefing the Scottish Government, John Swinney, and Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, on our defence industrial strategy. And that's based on an understanding that, if you like, defence is critical for the defence of the realm and the safety of the population. But if you get your defence policies right, it can be a really important driver of economic growth. And in that sense, we were talking to the Scottish Government saying, how do we work and collaborate together, for example, on making sure that colleges like Glasgow College or West College in West Central Scotland are delivering the apprenticeships, the skills, the capability for a workforce that we're going to need. We began the interview by talking about just how different the world is from 2007 or indeed 1997. Most people recognise that we're in a much more challenging geopolitical environment. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia means that countries right across Western Europe and within NATO are raising their defence expenditure. We want to make sure that that expenditure isn't just good for our national safety, but good for our national prosperity. And so with the launch of the Defence Industrial Strategy today, that would strike me as a really good example of the kind of initiative that, as a British government, we're determined to help deliver for Scotland.
A few other things going on. The NEC, the ruling body of the Labour Party, has come up with the timetable to elect the deputy leader. Why is it going to be so fast?
Well, partly because, in light of all the questions you've just been asking, Adam, we don't want the deputy leadership contest of the Labour Party to be a significant and long-standing distraction to getting on with the job of delivering the change that people are hungry for, want for us, and voted for us in order to achieve. So in that sense, I understand the NEC has set a timetable. That's the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party have set quite a tight timetable this morning. This is a party position. And if we were being distracted as a party and by a government, I don't think the country would want that. And I think it's right that we run a proper democratic election. But on the other hand, we stay focused on the jobs that we're being put there to do by the public.
Do you have an idea of what kind of person would be a good deputy leader in the current circumstances?
I haven't chosen a candidate. I'm not making a shock announcement on Newscast.
I know it's so funny. Every government minister is now being asked, and you're like, I'm sure they don't have time to do this, but I've got to ask anyway. Yeah.
Yes. But again, perhaps revealing my history. You know, I worked very closely with Harriet Harman when she was deputy leader under Gordon. I've got a lot of time for Harriet. She's an extraordinary role model, not just for women in politics, but more generally, she's an extraordinarily capable politician. John Prescott, of course, I knew very closely. He used to call me rather disparagingly one of the beautiful people. I can assure you that is the only time in my life I've ever been called one of the beautiful people. So in that sense,
what was he getting at there? The sort of your closeness to Blair?
There was a group of young bucks in and around Downing Street in the early years. I hasten to say one of them was, he might not thank me for admitting it, but Andy Burnham, who was then Tessa Gill's special advisor, James Purnell. There was a group of us who were either involved in policy or were newly elected into Parliament, and who John used to be somewhat disparaging about. But on the other hand, I was in party headquarters during the 2001 general election when he punched a member of the public in Row, and he knew that I went to the MAP forum that evening insisting that far from having broken the law, we needed to protect, support and stand up for our Deputy Prime Minister. So we ended up again with a very improbable friendship. So I think any of those people, whether it's Harriet Harman, whether it's John Prescott, they were both models of really effective deputy leaders doing great work for the party and supporting the government of the day.
But there's the dilemma, because you just quoted some giants there. Actually, it sounds to me like you'd be quite happy, or I'm kind of guessing from what you're saying, you'd be quite happy if it was a bit more of a minor figure getting this job, because you talked about the danger of this contest being a distraction. I mean, you could have a real big figure who's got a different political philosophy from Keir Starmer who becomes a distraction.
Adam, first a gotcha question and then you're putting words in my mouth. Far from it.
That's what happens in conversations.
No, honestly, I genuinely don't know who'll stand. I've seen some of the initial speculation over the weekend, and I think Harriet's come out this morning saying that it should be a female deputy leader. I saw the Andy Burnham comments saying that it should be somebody from the north or from the northwest yesterday. I genuinely don't know who put themselves forward, but I understand, given the tight timetable that's been set by the NEC, we'll find out pretty quickly, and then, like many other party members, I'll make my judgment.
And then on another policy question that's arisen today about immigration, and Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, she's done her first interview about her brief, and one of the headlines that came out of it was her saying, we will withdraw visas from countries that refuse to sign returns agreements for their nationals with the UK. Is that a sign of a tougher, harsher, more gloves off kind of Home Secretary?
Let's see. She's like all of us in the first couple of days in office. I think the meeting today that she was hosting was with representatives of the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing community of which the United Kingdom is part. I'm not going to deny to you there are real challenges that every country faces and every government faces in relation to immigration and illegal immigration in particular. And in that sense, I think that early move by Shabana is indicative of the fact that she gets it. She understands that there is real concern, not just in relation to small boats, but more generally in relation to how do we keep our borders secure and have control over who comes into our country and on what terms. And in that sense, that first step by her, I think, is a, if you like, a down payment in terms of the approach she's probably going to take.
And I was standing in for Nikki Campbell, another Scottish voice, on 5 Live on the phone in this morning. And quite a lot of people were saying, oh, yeah, this is proof that this cabinet is more right-wing than the previous cabinet. How would you respond to somebody sort of suggesting that was the case?
Well, listen, we're a progressive centre-left government. And in that sense, I mean, it speaks well of Radio 5 listeners that they are as focused and interested in who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. My honest sense is what matters much more than these ideological labels is the general sense of direction of the government, the capacity of the ministers who are put in place to deliver against those objectives. And of course, whether it's the party conference coming up in a few weeks' time, there'll be an opportunity for the Prime Minister to speak directly to the country. There will be that opportunity to set out this new government's approach in terms of the team that he put in place on Friday. But broadly, I don't think the labels are of that much interest other than to people with a particular political fascination. What I sense many more people are much more interested in is, are we delivering economic growth? If you look at the numbers, with the highest growth in the G7 in the course of the first 2 quarters of this year, are we delivering employment rights for people who are in precarious or uncertain working environments? We've delivered a big package of employment rights. Are we dealing with the threat of low pay in the country? 200,000 Scots, I now speak on behalf of Scotland at the Cabinet table, have seen a pay rise since last July. So there's a lot of work underway, but we totally get the fact that more needs to be done. And my sense is that rather than ideology, it's delivery that's going to be the main focus of this team.
And last question, and I promise this is not a gotcha. I'm just giving you an opportunity to clarify why you used a certain word there. You said this new government. Now, did you mean this new government in the very sort of like wonkish sense of the people running the country are in a slightly different configuration from how they were last week? You don't want us to think of this as like a new batch.
No, honestly, I was just being what I hope was factually accurate in the sense that I said this new team of those of us who were appointed on Friday. So is it a completely different government? No, it's a refreshed team that's going to take forward the work of the government. But in that sense, I think most of us who have moved into new roles both are deeply respectful of the work that was done by our predecessors, determined to drive that forward, but are alive to the fact that the country is really hungry for the change that people want to see and are determined to have our foot on the accelerator and get the pace going.
And just to be clear, that was a clarificatory question, not a gotcha, as you would describe it.
Thank you. I'll stop analysing your questions and you can start analysing my answers.
And presumably we're going to be chatting a lot in the next few months because you'll have an eye on the Scottish Parliament elections, which are going to be huge next year.
Yes, so we've got really big elections coming up in Scotland next May. We've had a Scottish government that's been in place since before the iPhone was invented. And in that sense, it's 2 decades of what I would characterise as failure, but certainly a long time from the SNP government. My sense is that there's a hunger and an appetite for change in Scotland, as there is across the UK, in terms of wanting to see progress. And in that sense, it's going to be a really big battle in Scotland in the coming months. And in the Scotland office, I'll be doing my part to make sure that in those months, the Labour government turns up, delivers for the people of Scotland. But you're right, there's going to be a very, very big challenge in the Scottish elections coming up next May in Holyrood.
I'm now just thinking other things that were happening around that time. So that obviously was 2007 when Alex Salmond became Prime Minister for the SNP. That was 2 years after YouTube had been invented.
That's right.
I doubt Game of Thrones had been on yet.
He became First Minister in May of 2007 and the iPhone was released generally in July of 2007. So think about it. That is a long time. What I find on the doorsteps now is when you say to somebody, just give us a single example of an area of Scottish public life that's got better since 2007. Even dyed-in-the-wool nationalists struggle to find an answer on education, on health, on housing, on skills, on everything. So in that sense, there's a real, I sense, appetite for change in Scotland, and that will be one of the big questions that people will be asking themselves between now and May.
And we will, of course, be asking SNP representatives if they'd like to contribute something
Other
they think has got better in Scotland since the pre-iPhone era. Douglas, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Adam. Good to speak to you. Thanks again.
Lots of interesting things there in that interview with Douglas Alexander. But Chris, what I thought was interesting was that, so the interview ended with me trying to get him to say that, the new cabinet has moved to the right because Shabana Mahmood is going to be kind of tougher on migration than Yvette Cooper was. But actually, if you go back to the start of the interview, he was trying to make the case that this is a cabinet who are completely focused on growth. So Douglas Alexander wants us to be thinking these are growth booster people, not cracking down on immigration, much harder than before people.
Yeah, and in reality, I think that they know that their political fate is tied more to those 2 issues than probably anything else. Yes, they've got to get down NHS waiting lists and various other things, but that immigration, massive, legal and illegal, no doubt about it, and growth. I'm speaking to cabinet ministers over the weekend, that kind of growth thing, and it gets into a conversation about workers' rights and the extent to which the government's ideas on that particular topic, in the fear of some, could get watered down, etc., etc. But the growth element of it, they're going to be stepping into over and over again, and it's one of those things that, in the end, Adam, as we know, you can straightforwardly measure. I mean, yes, an element of the economy comes down to sentiment, a sense of whether you feel better off and not just sort of national GDP numbers. But in the end, the size of the economy, the rate of growth of the economy and the immigration numbers are very measurable. And they know they've got to make progress on both, where the numbers from their perspective are not where they need to be.
Chris, lovely to catch up with you. And as I say goodbye to Chris, 6:49 on Monday, France has lost another Prime Minister. Francois Bayrou lost that vote of confidence, which he was widely expected to do, which he'd linked to the budget. So a bit more political paralysis in France. But Chris, great to be, well, you can't say there's paralysis in British politics. Never stops moving.
Indeed.
See you later.
Cheers.